Thanks a lot. Welcome everybody, and thanks a lot for inviting me, having the chance to talk here. I will now talk much more out of the practice of an urban planner, and quickly introduce myself. I'm trained as an interior designer, beginning or carpenter, and then architect, and then I went into urban design, and at the moment I'm running a KCAP, Case Christian's office in Zurich, dealing between the two scales of architecture and urban design, and also big scale and small scale urban design. And I will focus on two themes we work a lot with between these different scales. On one hand, the open city, and also infrastructure and mobility accessibility within city planning. Plus placemaking, let's say, on a level that is much more about architecture, the space in between buildings, and what do we need, let's say, in our everyday surroundings. And I will show three projects where infrastructure, mobility, accessibility, but really also infrastructure projects have a certain impact. One, let's say, as a kind of motor of urban development, then let's say that mobility really can also cause a lot of problems within an urban planning, let's say, within urban development, and how to deal with that. And one project from Asia, a really huge one, where also infrastructure lines, like mentioned on your brief and this nice poster you got, can also cause segregation and also really kind of build barriers between different kind of urban developments, and how to, let's say, overcome this and integrate this kind of as a, or let's say, transform it into a kind of connector between different kind of city areas. I found this image, let's say, of a huge infrastructure here in Stockholm. I have to admit, I really nearly don't know the city. What I saw till now looks really very nice, but I didn't saw the outskirts and also the problems, let's say, you deal with at the moment, kind of within this growing city. And the huge map you have to deal now the next week with, I think it's really interesting because you really have, a lot of you have to focus on really inner city areas, but you also have to focus on, let's say, kind of outskirts and really regional areas. And I hope you will really see also that the context you're working within is really very important on the answers you're talking about. So I like to address two themes. One is the open city, that's wherein really mobility and accessibility has an enormous impact. And the second is this theme of placemaking, starting with open city. You see here two images, city as a tree, and the open city, and you see what the spatially wise means. So you have city as a tree means you have a lot of really dead-end streets here. There's no accessibility from one part to the other. There's a certain social segregation by that, and this also can be caused by really huge infrastructures. They kind of cut off different bits and pieces of the city from each other. And there's, let's say, the problem of monofunctional program. I also heard you have to deal with, let's say, very often in the outskirts where a lot of really just residential areas are, and there's not so much program, mixed-use program, and also not so many services. Let's say where we like to go to all the time and focus on it is really go into the open city, multi-directional accessibility, coexistence between the different kind of areas, and also a very diverse, vibrant, colorful city. So this is really the notion, let's say, where we kind of start all the time. I like to address this on one project we were working between 2008 and 2009, a long time, the legacy framework for London, for the reuse of the integration of the Olympic venues back into the city fabric. They used it really as a kind of generator for urban development, the games, which we're gonna start now. So there are 5 spatial aspects about these concepts. On one hand, what you see already here, the different characters, that we really focus on different kind of character areas in, and also try to really improve this kind of different addresses and characters, identities within the city. So the maximal integration is very specific for this project of the Olympic investments and venues. A maximization of connectivity and accessibility of the different areas, promoting sustainable lifestyle and using this urban mosaic, let's say this kind of colorful, different kind of identities for as a base for urban planning. What you see here is, let's say, the improvement of accessibility within this kind of period of time. So you really can see an enormous increase of connectivity lines within this kind of area, the lower east dwelling, which has then, let's say, really an important impact on the vibrancy and also. You see here, let's say, how we try to knit these things together. and here over the lower East Valley kind of as a park to really connect with a lot of different mobility modes, transport lines, the accessibility and knitting back integration of this area into the city. So that really this kind of new urban fabric can appear with different identities within this kind of next to this existing node of Stratford Village. And the idea is really to get to this kind of colorful and very characteristic area, so that all the time also Ole Jensen was talking about the definition of places. Let's say that you really define specific places within this fabric to create certain identities and neighborhoods people like to live in next to each other. An enormous impact on that has a public transportation network, which was there already existing. So if we are in this kind of metropolitan, really denser areas, you need a certain amount of, a high amount of public transport accessibility. What I heard now is that there's also here in Stockholm, you talk about increase of individual transport. I'm afraid this will lead to a certain collapse at a certain point. I will mention this later on an example of Zurich, how they deal with the situation. It's a very small city, but they have this kind of problematic that they cannot deal with the amount of individual transport they have within the city. So you see here, let's say, accessible road network, which is really important, but you really have to kind of also define on which level the bigger lanes are the really drive-through areas, and then you kind of differentiate in other levels so that you really have areas that are much more kind of calm and not so used or not so accessible by individual transport, or it's more difficult to get there. You get there, but it's not really so convenient. And an enormous, what's really important is really kind of slow traffic network within this kind of area, so that you really have a pedestrian and cycle network, and this is the key accessibility within your neighborhood. Within this framework, this is a framework for development, and we deal all the time, you will see this later on a little bit more in detail, kind of a hybrid frame, an open framework, so it's not kind of completely planned everything, so we kind of only plan certain aspects, especially, let's say, the accessibility, the road network, and within that you have development fields. They can be filled in relation to a rule set we kind of define, but this is a kind of robust and flexible framework that can adapt to the change of external parameters. So, for instance, if you have, we're dealing in a lot of other countries now in the Netherlands, for instance, with this economical crisis. So we're talking now about shrinking, so there are political, economical, but also sociological kind of changes an urban plan has to be able to deal with. So it's not a fixed kind of planning from top. You plan only just, let's say, what's necessary to be planned, and the rest you keep as much as possible flexible that the city can really grow and develop. This is a possible exemplary layout within this thing, so it can really also grow in different kind of ways. And an overview how this could look like, and now quickly how this really can grow. But let's say there could be also another possible infill. So it's really, let's say, these high points could also appear on a different spot. This is really kind of mainly try to keep this flexible. Next issue, next theme I'd like to focus on is placemaking. Again, on this kind of example of London, you see a lot of different kind of areas and colorful, let's say, identities. This will be is the development. Let's say there the Olympics took part, so it's really a new spot in the city and a kind of extension of the city framework. And within that, we really try to focus on different character areas. So the different colors show really different identities, so that you have a kind of neighborhood that you really feel familiar with. Let's say Berlin is a very good example of this kind of called Kiez. So a lot of different villages, let's say, form this kind of city. And interesting enough, people living in Berlin, they kind of not so often go out of their Kiez. So they stay in their area because they have everything they need for their everyday life in that. And that's the focus, let's say, try to deal with kind of you really to try to define areas where you can work, you can live, you have your service, you have the school, etc. So you don't need necessarily to commute. For sure, people will commute, but you provide, let's say, the maximum possibility that people can stay in their area. There's something a bit weird now. So placemaking, quickly, as a term, began to be used in the 1970s, creating squares, plazas, parks, streets, waterfronts, whatever. What's interesting is, someone mentioned here enough, let's say we have to deal with a lot of theories, specialism, regulations, exercises, demonstration projects. We have as planners we're so focused on certain issues that we, I think, and also mentioned here by Bernadette, that we really lost a little bit, simply lost the art of placemaking, or let's call it differently, that we have lost the simple art of placemaking. How to really make a place and what really kind of needs, what are the parameters you need to define a place. So here, for instance, one image is the real sense of a place. Or is this the real sense of a place? Here, quite empty, question mark. This is an example in Rotterdam. So there is no kind of activated grade level, so there's no life, let's say, on this kind of things. This is one container where this kind of happens. This is a place within this container. This is another one, but completely different area. This is another container, let's say the example of Asia, Shanghai, wherein this is a very vibrant and inhabited, kind of used place. This is another one with completely different conditions. And the question is really, can we make, let's say, really make places? Can we really define them? And should they not be a result rather than an input? And what can we do to really create, let's say, these possibilities? And we heard earlier also that temporary uses are, let's say, a motor to create places, to really proactively, let's say, develop a certain sense of a place and also a perception of people of a place, and then afterwards, that's the gentrification process starts. And how do we do that? It's a rebuild history in several ways. Or do we have to build modern? This is an image of the Lijnbaan in Rotterdam, a very, let's say, the first pedestrian area. A lot of commercial spaces, but during the night time, let's say, because there is a certain lack of residential space around, it's quite empty. Another example from Rotterdam, what are the most important elements to define a place? And I'd like to address here 5 points. Let's say on one hand, what's really important, let's say, within urban planning, and we very often focus also on our presentations then really on the grade level, that is really the ground floor, and what happens on the ground floor. So if the ground floor is active, it's not so important what's happening above, so to say, and that's also the first perspective you have as a person moving and walking through a city. This is two is, the question is really achieving a fine grain on this ground, let's say a different mix of program, but also really nice public space so that people really can walk in secure, but also have lots of possibilities to sit, to stay. You see another example over here. Again, the Lijnbaan in Rotterdam. But another point is also the adaptability of these places, that people really can use it, they can kind of change it, they kind of use it in certain different ways. Like you see here, for instance, it's a water play, but people just use it as a playground. It's not mentioned like, but they use it. Another example from the Schouwburgplein in Rotterdam, where also people really inhabit it, perform on this kind of square. So define spaces where people really can to create niches people really like to inhabit and perform in. A fourth point is let's say that the sum of the aspects and kind of program around in a place really define it, and build then this kind of vibrant areas and also places to go and define the character of a certain quarter neighborhood in a city. You see here again this kind of image like we, for London, to really define different kind of attractors within this urban fabric. People really can also tell, it's my neighborhood, it's my kind of Kiez, so to say. Going back to, let's say, mobility infrastructure and also infrastructure developments, what kind of impact has infrastructure? Within a city fabric, you see here a kind of polycentric idea about city, and I think a lot of, let's say, all city developments go in this direction. For instance, the airport or the center, which is not really 100% working, the center, but you can see it kind of have a certain impact on the development of a city, especially airports and also train stations are hubs where around, let's say, the city really develops in a very kind of automatic autopilot, let's say, on an autopilot status way. And next to that, there appear certain breeding grounds. What you can see, for instance, here with Schiphol Airport, you see in red the airport services and supplies, the terminals and all the kind of garage spaces around. But what happens is that the whole city airport kind of, we talk about nowadays airport cities, so there is kind of really pressure on the development around airports, but also other kind of infrastructural hubs. People come there, people meet there. Schiphol Airport, at the moment, or other airports function as a kind of city in itself, so you can live there, you have hotels, you have a kind of service supplies, you have convention centers. So people just meet there because it's the most accessible place for, let's say, from different kind of cities within Europe, for instance, or also international, global, that has a certain impact and a kind of automatic development around these kind of places. The same about city centers, but especially, let's say, station areas within the city center. You see here, I focus now a little bit more on Switzerland. You see here the public transportation net of Switzerland. And around the name of Zurich, this is the main station, central station. The city kind of develops like that around the lake. And Switzerland is very special in, let's say, in this kind of policy of public transportation. So the public transportation system is perfect, so to say. You can get in each valley, let's say by bus, let's say you have, and each level of public transportation mode is, even if it's a private company, you will buy on one point, let's say, or via your SBB, your app, or let's say the station, a ticket for all the kind of different mobility supplies. And I think that's really important. So you have one address where you get your ticket, and then you kind of, whether it's a bus or it's a private company, whatever, it's all connected, and it's one, let's say, company that provides, let's say, the ticketing. What they have is, let's say, within the city, it's very easy to get into the city by public transportation. It's incredibly difficult to get into the city by individual transportation. So we had, for instance, we were dealing with this project, let's say, also that's what I like to mention is this infrastructural project. It's a kind of new drive-through possibility with a train. The central station is over, let's show it here, is over here. And it's a terminal, or it was a terminal, there's already a drive-through station. They built a second one, but they need to build this huge infrastructure to really get, let's say, the trains out of to bring the trains out of the city, to bring them to the north of Germany. This is an ongoing project at the moment, and because of this infrastructure project, the whole area around the station, you see here already this kind of building. See, this is a central station in the middle, and I see on the other side, let's say, this development area gets free. And it's, let's say, the best connected spot in the whole country, and will be, let's say, now developed into an inner city mixed-use area. It was the first project. You see here one infill in the plan. It was the first project where we not had to build, let's say, discuss about parking places, because we were just only allowed to build, I don't know the number anymore, but it was a ridiculous number of parking places, because this is the best spot accessible by public transport, and you have to get there by public transport. So for all residential spaces, there will be no parking place at all. And that's very, very special, let's say. I, for instance, I live now since 2006 in Zurich. I don't have a car because a car is really just only expensive. You don't find a parking place. You get everywhere by public transportation. You are, let's say, very quickly at the central station, and the airport is connected with the central station by a train. You need about 15 minutes. So everything is kind of in a short, it's a small city, but still it's really an enormous kind of connectivity within the country, and you don't need, let's say the car is more difficult. If I have to drive through, to a place within the city, you have to do, let's say, this, kind of like this kind of flower range. So you're much better, you better take public transport or the bicycle, and you're much quicker, say, over there. What we did then here, just showing, let's say, this idea of an open framework, we try to, let's say, integrate a certain density within this kind of, on this kind of spot. They were asking for an enormous density of 3.1, which is for Zurich really high. They have an average density of 2. And what you see here is just an envelope talking about this open framework. We really define from, let's say, this existing urban fabric, wherein, let's say, then buildings can appear in certain different levels. So what we said is we defined a certain section also that you have this kind of average height of 18 meters. The existing height here is between 17 and 20 meters, so average 18. From there, kind of, you have to tip back, so high-rise can appear, but not kind of on this kind of direct edge of the block, a perimeter block, so that as a kind of pedestrian, you all the time see only this kind of existing city fabric, and the density will appear then, like you see here, on top and on the perimeter block and tipped into the perimeter block. What you see here, you see this kind of envelope as a wireframe and a possible infill, but all these kind of infills are within this kind of framework possible. So you can discuss about kind of, this is, let's say, this kind of robust plan, what I talked about in the beginning, that you just give a framework. The city fabric is still the same. So all the kind of streets follow, let's say, the existing contextual grid, but how you fill this in, this will be kind of defined by the market and the developers afterwards. We cannot do this, we can kind of, as a planner, cannot predict this in advance. Very often this kind of plans needs 20, 30, 40 years that they they will develop. The economical situation can change completely. So they also have to be robust, to take an infill of office space, but also residential space. Okay, this went much quicker because it's, let's say, the fillet piece within the city. So you see here already, let's say, how this will look like, and the first silhouettes appearing. Another project I like to show you is a master plan for Perm, with a completely different aspect of, to see it here. So this is Russia, and the problem there was kind of Russia is an enormous country, and they have enormous space, so they don't have to take care there is not a lack of space, so they kind of just spread, and the problem was then the result of this kind of development within the city was that they got an enormous problem of congestion and commuting. So they couldn't handle anymore the second people kind of moving into the city because they were so far living outside. Plus, you have this kind of effect that there is no really dense, vibrant, mixed-use urban life, but there are vast areas of green wasteland, so to say, within the city center that make the city not attractive. So we were asked by the governor to really think about how can we kind of find a certain framework wherein, let's say, the city can develop in a more dense, let's say, way. And what you see here is kind of several layers we were kind of dealing with. On one hand, the building mass, and we had to have to build public space network, street network, accessibility network, very important, but also a mixed-use concept. Because in Russia, you have very often the situation, you have this monofunctional residential areas, they are completely, let's say, dead during the day and empty. But you have, then there is no supply, there are no services, there are no supplies, there's nothing, everybody has to get into the city. So really focusing on also there certain in itself autark functioning areas that people don't have, let's say, for all the kind of everyday things to commute. Plus defining certain priority lines. Building mass was an enormous, let's say, big issue to deal with. We were kind of calculating this, also block rules, etc., but I will not dive into that. And what we developed is then this kind of map where you see the darkest red areas are really the central zones where they should be densified. The lighter it gets, the more suburban, and then here with the purple and kind of pink and rose areas, you see developments, this kind of sprawl that already happened. And there we said they have to stay as a certain kind of in a village character, but not kind of forcing the sprawl further. You see also kind of green corridors into the city, and they also started, let's say, to develop over there because they have the land, so they were thinking about building bridges. And we convinced them to kind of really densify this area, build only in the areas they already developed, because there's already a university on the other side, but not kind of spreading out the city because they have not even, let's say, really structurally bridges at the moment. And if you would densify this here, you need to have much more connection points over the river. Let's say we showed them, for instance, a comparison between London, Paris, and, for instance, Rotterdam with 2 bridges. And Rotterdam had the problem, Paris is really completely connected. Let's say you have a kind of range of bridges over the Seine, it's enormously. That's why it is working as a kind of concentric city. But here it would not somehow work. And these bridges would be the bottlenecks of transportation at a certain point, because the people need all the time have to go via this kind of bottlenecks into the existing city. What you see too is kind of green corridors. They didn't have really a kind of idea of this kind of nature. Nature has very nice valleys, these green corridors, but they used them as a kind of waste area. You could find there fridges, laundry machines, whatever you can think about. But they needed, let's say, as a kind of lung for fresh air and so on into the city. So we really defined that as a kind of all green is, let's say, no building zone. And that has to do, and I think that's also interesting to do, it's also to do with the kind of the cultural or the cultural background of the people there. So in Russia, nobody takes really care of the public domain, because that was covered very long time by the state. If you go to a Russian, kind of not Moscow, that's really a special city, but let's say that where people take care of ends at their entrance door of the dwelling, and the rest they think somebody else has to do. So these kind of aspects are all the time very important. Let's say if you work as an urban planner, go quickly through these rules. So this is really now the green public space network that goes also very often along with we try to all the time combine this with the street network. So you really have a public space network and green network that goes together with this mobility network to also provide there certain quality. Public transportation, long lines and radials, you see now, let's say, also the hierarchy, let's say, of this mobility structure. And then there is, on one hand, the street structure to the city, but also very, very, very dense and covering nearly everything public transportation network, which is important to really be able to serve these sizes of cities. And then the mixed use concept, so that you really have a certain centrality, and along the crucial radials, there is already existing program integrated, but in this kind of framework, in a most inner city framework, there are, let's say, this kind of mixed use areas, the purple ones, and only in the outskirts or, for instance, facing the river, really residential program. And next to that, defining a certain idea of priority spots where the development should start, so that you really have a center point, but you create also sub-centers within this kind of network. So, and these should work as a kind of autark areas, so that not everybody has to jump into the city. And this goes in overlay with a mobility network. And you see here, let's say the situation, here a lot of this kind of vocation houses, here there is a university, but what we said, and they really tried to develop then kind of this area, and we said densify within that and keep this as a natural recreation area for a long time, because you don't need to, because otherwise you, like I already mentioned, get this kind of congestion problem over, you see how this kind of, what's within this area still possible, let's say to densify the same, let's say for a western inner city part of the center, what's possible kind of to, within the urban fabric, so that there is a critical mass after all that creates certain places. And within these places, there's enough mass and density to define really a vibrant urban kind of public space people like to inhabit and people like to live in. The last project I like to show is the Creative Gateway in Shenzhen, where we had to deal with this inner city part. You see the site here. There's a big railway track over there, and there's a huge traffic line over here. So there was no connectivity between these two parts, and there's a complete rupture also between these two parts of the city. So kind of the worst side of infrastructure, it really cuts off and segregates. And what does it need, let's say, to really transform this into a gateway, so to say, a connector between the two parts? Here we also kind of approach kind of lively neighborhoods, quality open spaces, obviously the same, let's say, the same aspects like I already talked before. What we did is really looking to the site what kind of typologies or morphology is existing, and it was quite poor, let's say, and also very monofunctional, like you see on this image. And then trying to develop here also a framework with different kind of tools, green strategy and urban mosaic, really also again defining different identities, but also transportation. And there was an existing, let's say, green belt, but through this kind of infrastructure is completely disconnected. Okay, not really visible. And you see this kind of already existing kind of traffic line. This is the railway zone, and trying to focus then on this connector and also building sub-centers within that kind of green belt to really provoke and investigate this kind of connectivity between both sides. And you see this here, that's kind of revealing really the green qualities, the existing qualities, connector here, another connection there, and also inner connection over here. Increasing, let's say, the green network that goes along with the mobility network. Integrating in that also the water system, so that water is on one hand kind of an additional attraction to the public space network, but it also works as a kind of sustainable system, so to deal with surface water, etc., within this kind of system. So it all the time has these two levels, and not only aesthetic one, you can see here. This is then the overlay of all the aspects in green network, densify within this kind of, within this already dense urban fabric, but in relation to and according to different kind of rules. So densify within the existing fabric, keeping the street network and defining also a secondary layer of connectivity between this kind of blocks, so that there are really kind of different hierarchies in connectivity. And also guidelines in relation to the rules, in relation to the existing, so that you really frame with the building volume the streetscape, so you define already a certain orientation, and not kind of putting buildings like bits and pieces, like cake pieces on a plate. They're not defining kind of orientation guidelines and spatial lines, and also not defining a certain inner and an out, let's say, differentiation between public. What you have here, you have clear differentiation between public and private space. This defines then all these new urban areas. And this is now how we did understand, let's say, this kind of coming now to the mobility network. So this is the existing network and the rail track. Then we added a new kind of new inner connections within the area. And then you see the kind of framework of different kind of levels of connectivity lines. So you have really express routes, they are already existing, you have then the major arterials, but we also defined a very fine mesh of different kind of mobility systems, so that really the inner area is connected, the mobility is certain and maximized. And this goes then together with a really slow traffic cyclists and walkable areas, so to define really areas in itself, they can work in an autark way. Public transportation network also connecting then over this gap. And let's say as one of the last levels in the parking network, and this is then, let's say, within that a kind of completely different kind of mesh than you saw in the beginning of the existing. And if we go now within this enormous area of mixed use, you see here, let's say, the existing mixed use, what we try to, a bit fragmented in all this kind of bits and pieces, and what we try to do is really defining also here certain character areas and in itself coherent quarters. They will be developed also with, like you see the icons, with different kind of typologies, so you really define certain kind of districts and neighborhoods, they work in itself and also have certain border to the neighbors. And define within that certain, let's say, really qualities, mixed use and lively urban spaces on the grade level within this overall mosaic where we define this kind of color, in different colors, identities and characters. And let's say to define within this sheer enormous mass of Asian development, really quality in spaces that really provide certain-hand European kind of city qualities and public space qualities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I see some students leaving. All right. Well, now we have, let's take a few questions, and then we're going to have a panel debate. We're going to set up a table here, and we'll have a discussion here. And I think it's worth staying, especially for the students. Okay, so let's take the first questions.
Yeah, while discussing PERM, you just said that, or actually one of the pictures or one of the sheets said that suburban shopping is a danger. And what do you think about Stockholm then, in that, concerning that?
No, I think you had that. Yeah, the suburban shopping means that they really define big shopping malls in the outskirts.
Yeah.
Let's say because that has, let's say, the attraction, let's say, from the city center.
Yeah, I completely understand that, but it's like the same way around here in Stockholm, because every small city that's suburban has its own shopping mall, or almost every one of them. And is it, or it's probably a general question to all of the guys here. Is it a problem in Stockholm? Because we are to develop some of the quarters of Stockholm, and is that a proper way to develop the city here in Stockholm?
I think if you have, let's say, it's not, I would not call it, draw it so black and white. Let's say if you have a neighborhood, you need certain daily supplies and you need this kind of shopping mall. It's more, but it should be in this kind of developments. Very often the problem is that these shopping malls are somewhere in the green, completely out of some settlement, so everybody's driving there. If this is in a settlement with a lot of residential space and other program around, no problem at all. Because you really kind of can get your everyday supplies in your neighborhood. It's more, I think this mentions more kind of really shopping malls, like I don't know the Stockholm situation, like in France. You drive, let's say, along a highway and you get everything and you drive there once a week and you buy your everyday supplies and that's it. But this creates no urban life in the area. That's what we are talking about here.
I think these strategies you're proposing, they're pretty much exactly what Jane Jacobs was saying in the 60s almost. So
you're right.
What do you think, what has happened in the last 50 years that was not the same back then? Or do you think, is this like a universal solution to city life with a...
I think this works pretty everywhere, but we were discussing previously also that there are certain issues of developers or also kind of economic-based firms. They kind of think about this differently. And that's these motors we really have to try to find. Let's say urban planning is also all the time, we can do a lot of plans. If we don't have, let's say, the stakeholders and the kind of people next to us and they kind of also can convince them, it's just a plan and it stays a plan.
So is it different nowadays that politicians have the same, share this vision and think that the same strategies are efficient, like smaller blocks and ground floor activity and all these things?
I think so, because let's say we're dealing with a lot of this kind of problems. They came from other kind of certain developments. Let's say for instance, we're dealing with a lot of greenfield campuses at the moment, and they're somewhere outside of a city and really problematic. And now we have to reintegrate, let's say, to reactivate them, that they are kind of working in itself, autark. They have they have supplies. You're able to live in. You kind of create a certain campus working and living campus, instead of kind of pushing this somewhere outside and it's completely lone standing and people just go back and forth and end of the day it's completely empty. And we have, for instance, these problems also in the Netherlands with a lot of these brain parks somewhere along a highway. You just have to cut them down because they're not working anymore. On one hand, let's say it's clear now, let's say with the crisis, they're getting empty because these are the spots, they are not attractive anymore. And we have to get to a certain kind of urban fabric that we really kind of develop density around public transportation nodes and not somewhere where you can drive by car. Because let's say what I heard before, let's say that there's still a kind of enormous investment in individual transportation here in the city. I think it should really get to the other side, kind of not investment in individual transport, but in public transportation and trying to really define urban city areas, they kind of in itself somehow attack. You go then to the center because you want to go to the theater, you don't have everything, let's say, next to your house, but let's say your all daily supplies you have. And make it more difficult, a lot of, like London, make it difficult to get into the city it has to hurt, I have to say, it has to hurt. It has to cost money, or it has to be a pain in the ass to drive to the city, and then people really change. As long as I get a parking place, as long as I have a wide street, I try to take my car. I'm the same, let's say, if Zurich would not be so difficult to drive in, I would also have a car because I would be much more flexible. But I need an hour to get rid of this car, so yeah, I don't take it. I don't have one because it's just, but it really has to hurt. And it has to, I think, let's say, I think human nature is also a little bit like that. Let's say, if we have then a certain problem or there is a collapse, then we start to think and then we start to kind of act. So it's not proactive, it's all the time. It's very often it's reaction on, let's say, a certain problem.